What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today we're going to be taking a look at What Do You Meme's live stream he did with Mike Licona and David Wood.
Mike Licona actually wrote this book, which you guys have heard me recommend probably on live streams. It's The Resurrection of Jesus, and in this book it's a massive beast, right? And this book is awesome though, because what I really liked about it, if you're looking for like an objective perspective too, on like somebody is trying to be as unbiased as possible and evaluating like most of the, some of the, you guys, direct data. I can't remember how you qualified it, relating to Jesus in the first century. And that book is like, it's the best that I know of as far as that.
Oh, I wonder what kind of objective look at the resurrection that a Christian apologist did. Considering that Mike Licona is still a Christian, I'm guessing this objective look wasn't so objective. If you're interested in this analysis of Mike Licona's bad historiography, then please stay tuned.
You know, when Gary Habermas and I were finishing up our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, we were almost done in 2002. And at that time, I remember asking him, I said, Doc, why is it you've got this bibliography, which I think it had 22 or 2,400 sources. Now it's about 3,500, maybe even more. 2,400 sources at that point, written by scholars from 1975 up until that present day, which again was around, I think it was 2002.
Exactly how many books have been written on the resurrection that say the exact same shit? Sure, they could solely analyze on one particular portion of the resurrection or of Jesus in general, but it seems like all of these guys have their own particular book that argues the exact same arguments for the resurrection. Also, just because you found a lot of people that agree with your conclusion does not mean that your conclusion is correct. This is just an ad populum fallacy because he's sitting there like, well, all of these people agree with my conclusion, therefore I'm well supported and I am correct. No, you're not. This type of argument reminds me of the apologetic about how the Bible's been copied and transcribed so many times in history and how we have so many thousands of copies of the Bible that inherently makes the Bible true. I don't really care how many copies something has or how important the book is to one particular group or another. It doesn't speak to the truth of what's in the book. Now, Licona goes on to discuss his conversation with Gary Habermas about the current state of New Testament studies.
And he said, well, you've got a few philosophers, but most are New Testament scholars. And I thought, well, are there any professional historians, general historians who, they're trained in how to do historical investigations? Are there any who have done, an investigation of the resurrection? He said, yeah, there's a handful, but they're journal articles and very small books, but nobody's done an exhaustive one. So I thought, wow, I'd like to do that.
For one thing, Mike Licona is not a historian. He has a bachelor's in music performance, specializing in the saxophone, a master's in religious studies, which he got at Liberty University, and a PhD in New Testament studies. I'm not sure if he started off going for a general history degree, but he definitely did not end up in a general history degree. Where he actually ended up was the circle jerk that is New Testament studies. As recalled by Licona, Gary Habermas states that the current field of New Testament studies is filled with people that are not general historians. They are definitely not taking a look at the evidence objectively, and they are not applying the same historical methods that are used in other fields of history. One of the most common things I face with my position as a mythicist is how many teaching historians support my particular ideas or positions. It's kind of hard to have anybody in the New Testament studies field back up what you're saying as a mythicist when the entire field is primarily made up of people that have to believe in a resurrection and have to believe in a historical Jesus as part of their deeply held religious belief. And oftentimes it's mandated by the institutions that they are teaching at. If you want to be honest, the state of New Testament studies is a big circle jerk of Christians.
I had been plagued with doubts over the years, and I thought, well, I want to do an investigation. I entered this with the objective of proving the resurrection of Jesus. So I know I already have my biases, right?
And that's where you fucked up, Mike. You fucked it up! You see, you came to the investigation looking to prove your hypothesis. That's not how you should investigate your hypothesis. You see, using that, you only find things that support your idea. Anything that could possibly disprove your idea is either not going to be considered or is just going to be pushed to the side as if it doesn't matter. This is because you're only looking for things that confirm your current position. When you test your hypothesis, you want to try to find things that will disprove it. This is because you can have a lot of evidence to support your hypothesis, but it only takes one piece of evidence to disprove your hypothesis.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm going to do an objective investigation and prove that God exists or prove that he doesn't exist. Well, you've already shown your biases rather than just seeking to see, does God exist or did Jesus rise from the dead? And so I realized that I had my own biases and they certainly threatened the integrity of my investigation.
I'm glad that you recognize this, Mike. But ultimately, you let your Christian bias poison your investigation. Yes, we all do have our own biases. But that's why peer review exists, and that's also why you try to find things that will break your hypothesis instead of trying to confirm your hypothesis. If it can be broken, then you need to rework your hypothesis so that it can actually explain everything that it's supposed to. A good hypothesis will hold up to scrutiny. Mike continues on to talk about how this investigation really made him struggle with his faith. Luckily, he had his Christian apologist friends to tether him to the Christian dogma, which ultimately poisons his conclusion.
But I was really struggling with this, and I wanted to do an investigation to say, hey, if we applied strictly controlled historical method, what would an investigation of Jesus' resurrection look like? And I could live with it if historical investigation turned up, inconclusive. But I couldn't remain a Christian if historical investigation pointed away from Jesus' resurrection. So, yeah, it took a while, but it was heart-wrenching. It was one of the toughest things I've done in my life, but very rewarding.
I'm sure that it was really hard for you, Mike. And it really does seem like you got close to taking off those Christian-colored lenses and taking an actual objective look at the evidence. But you managed to retain your bias and actually lean harder into it as you were investigating the case for the resurrection. As we will see, his Christian bias infects his arguments and investigation so much, it causes him to say things that no historian would say. It causes him to apply criteria that is only seen in New Testament studies. He stays firmly planted in his Christian dogma the entire investigation.
One of the things
quick comment on because I missed it when you guys were mentioning this book. If you guys watch my debate on the resurrection with John Loftus, where even atheists were saying I schooled him, this was the main resource I used for my study on this. So good stuff here.
Oh, so we have it being used in action, do we? Well, what do these purely objective arguments look like?
You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances. But a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If my friend Paul here takes a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to him, the rest of us aren't going to ask for his pot of gold because we're not going to see him. It's only in Paul's mind. The leprechaun doesn't exist outside of his mind. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings are willing to die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. The disciples saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had been dead, alive again, standing in front of them, telling them why he had to die and rise again. Unfortunately for our atheist friends, the only sort of thing that can do that is Jesus actually appearing to them, which means that Jesus rose from the dead.
So it's pretty much the same bad historiography and bad arguments that's found in every supposed historical look at the case for the resurrection. Figures. Hallucinations are far more likely than a Jewish man rising from the dead and only appearing to a select number of people that have already had contact with this idea of a Messiah, as well as knowing what other people looked like in general. In the clip, Wood acts like these hallucinations can't have some kind of general theme to them, and this is directly contrary to what we see in reality now. We see themes being applied to hallucinations all the time. UFO abductees. They generally relay similar information, and you can even subdivide those particular experiences up into different versions of the same experience. Also, when you hear about people having an experience of an angel or these near-death experiences that are most likely hallucinations, those also take on similar general themes. This is what religion does to a historian when they start investigating their own faith. It causes them to have ad hoc statements that are not supported by the evidence.
One thing I really did enjoy about Mike's book, probably my favorite part about the book, is his section on the way history is done. It's called like historical epistemology. If you're familiar with that term, it's just kind of how we come to know things. And in that book, he has like a pretty good section on the different methodologies and stuff that historians take and why it's important to have these criteria so that way we can look past our biases as well. And so I think that's one thing that a lot of people aren't really familiar with. And because of that, they may not understand like the quality of the evidence, or they don't know how to kind of organize the evidence when it comes to historical evidence and the resurrection. So
it's not that we don't know how to organize the evidence. The criteria that you present here are meant to circumvent this bias that skeptical people have when they start taking a look at your faith. The criteria actually reinforce the bias that you have. Like I said before, this criteria that they use is only ever used in New Testament studies to prove that Jesus resurrected and to prove that he existed. And the only thing they're looking to circumvent is your ability to critically take a look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Next is a really good example of their criteria putting on these Christ-colored glasses for you.
Let's first start about, what do you think about miracles? Can history show miracles or prove miracles? What is your kind of position on that, and what do you think?
Yeah, I do think they can.
Okay, and there we go. That's it. So,
yeah, I do think historians can investigate, and in principle, they could prove miracle claims. And when I say prove, I'm using prove in a relative sense. I mean, none of us can get into a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusion. So when I say prove, I'm talking about reasonable certainty, of course.
Mike Licona hides behind the fact that you can't 100% prove that a miracle happened in history, let alone anything else in history. He recontextualizes miracles to make it seem like they're just any other event that has happened in history. This reference class does not actually describe the case of miracles. Miracles would be violations of the natural order of reality, whether a God exists or not. The reference class of other events that follow this natural order of reality does not fit miracles. He has to do this in order for his points to make sense. This is the same kind of tactic that creationists use to make their arguments seem plausible. Creationists have to argue against uniformitarianism in order to make their point, and that's exactly what Mike Licona is doing here.
And so does that mean that there is no historical evidence because here's the thing is, like, you'll see a lot of atheists who will say, like, oh, it's in the history. They kind of throw out history in whole, well, we weren't there 2,000 years ago. There was a comment earlier that said that, well, how am I supposed to believe something that happened 2,000 years ago?
Well, can't you apply that to Caesar's crossing the Rubicon?
Yeah.
In 49 BC, or his assassination at the Ides of March, 44 BC.
Yeah.
Of course, you can prove some things of the past with reasonable certainty. You can't with 100% certainty, because there's all kinds of challenges to learning about the past.
Here, Licona is using the vagueness of history to hide his historical evidence for his faith. History can be pretty vague, and the historical evidence for some events in history is not as abundant as we would like. That is the only place where Licona's evidence has any validity. Mike goes on to basically describe historiography and how he analyzed sources. Like, who records an event, when did they record it, who were their sources, and if they are independent or not. Then he says this.
You look at sources, and then you look at what can we mine from those sources, come up with what we call facts that we can believe with reasonable certainty. And then you formulate hypotheses to say what hypotheses can account for these facts. And then you assess those hypotheses to see which one best accounts for those facts.
All of this that he just said is subjective. At the heart of the historical method, it's very subjective as to what you think explains the facts. To Licona, God existing and Jesus rising from the dead explains all of the facts. And it does explain those facts, but we have yet to prove that God exists and that somebody can rise from the dead in the manner that Jesus did. Occam's razor says that a hypothesis among competing hypotheses that has the least amount of ad hoc assumptions attached to it is most likely the correct one. The two assumptions that Licona and all other apologists have to make in this particular context are ad hoc, unfounded assumptions. Next time, we're going to take a look at Mike Licona and how he argues for the resurrection of Jesus. A couple of arguments get brought up, and he tries to circumvent them in ways that might surprise you. So, tune in next time for that particular analysis. For now, though, I would really love to hear what you think down below. Leave me a comment about how Mike Licona did in this video. Do you think he had good points, or do you think that he still has his Christian-colored glasses on? While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.